Morning, folks. Welcome back. This will be the last lecture for Unit 5, so we'll be finished this today. Expect today, maybe an hour or two afterwards, after this video, I will be posting your project. I'm not going to make a video going through the project just because, it would be just so you'll have two videos to look at. It'll all be self-explanatory. And then you'll just do it, and then you'll submit it whenever you're finished. So keep your eyes open for that. We're going to finish today. We're on student activity 36. So this is page 17 in your booklet if you've been going through the booklet, or slide 51. So we're going to talk about the perspective on national identity in Canada. So we talked yesterday about the multicultural or internationalism and organizations related to internationalism. But the time before that, we spent a little bit of time focusing on Canada as in relation to self-determination and the different groups in Canada which advocate for their own form of self-determination. So we're going to jump back and focus our attention on Canada and this idea of national identity. We talked about that in Unit 1, but now we're going to readdress it with a lot more context behind the words that we're going to use. So we're going to focus our attention on the question of what are Canada's perspectives on national identity. Because like we talked about in Unit 1, Canada is a civic nation. That means we are bound together by our belief in the civic laws and the structure of law within our country, the Constitution, our parliament, our elected officials. These are the things that draw us together as a people because we're not all the same ethnicity. We're not all the same culture. So we are brought together based on our differences by that one agreement that we will abide by the same laws. So how is Canada's perspective on national identity shaped on the fact that we have so many different people? And like we talked about 2 days ago on Monday, there are people who are fighting for their own beliefs and their own ideas and their own cultures, ethnicities, and things like that within this greater group that we call Canadian. So, the terms that we're going to introduce today. Quebec sovereignty. So we talked about it a little bit on Monday. We're going to go a little bit more in depth with it today. Federal, provincial, and territorial relations. Land claims. Pierre Trudeau. He is the father of Justin Trudeau. I know I've said that a few times, but just repetition. Bilingualism and multiculturalism. So we're going to go through these terms and you'll have a good understanding of all of them. So I know we have talked about bilingualism and multiculturalism, but now we're going to just add a little bit more depth to this in relation to our understanding of how they relate to Canada's perspective on national identity. So we'll start with Quebec. So we saw last time that Quebec nationalism and Quebec's ideas of self-determination have become this idea of Quebec sovereignty. And this sovereignty movement is related to French Canadian nationalism. Language and culture is very distinct from the rest of Canada, so they have set in motion to kind of the idea of creating a sovereign nation, their own country, has been something that's been bouncing around for many years. So Quebec's place in Canada, it's always been up for debate, and it was really put into question in the 1960s with the formation of the Parti Québécois, and their basically idea about how Quebec should traverse this idea of self-determination and its relation to French Canadian nationalism. So throughout the 1980s and the early 1990s, Quebec's sovereignty movements accelerated with several referendums and an attempt to change the constitution occurred. So we showed, there was that image in Monday's video where it actually went down to like percentages of yes and no for staying in Canada. But before that, we did see an extreme expression of Quebec separatism occur when the FLQ, the Front de Libération du Québec, which was founded in the 1960s, kind of essentially taking it on their shoulders to have a separatist movement seen as a liberation movement. So a separatist movement could be something political, like an election to separate from a country. So a recent example, not just Canadian but outside, is Spain. So in Catalonia, a province of Spain, they've had elections where they have wanted to separate and they voted for it. Now the Spanish government has said that's not going to happen, but it didn't escalate into something like what we saw with the FLQ, who essentially turned this into a liberation movement. So when you turn separatism into a liberation movement, liberation essentially means you're being liberated from something. And what are you usually being liberated from? It's from oppression. So they see and they saw the federal government as an Anglo Canadian government that was oppressing the minority rights of the French Canadians, so language and culture. So they took to using violence. So we saw the use of violence with the FLQ, and the federal government's response was actually to introduce what was known as the War Measures Act, which essentially allows the military to go in and act as police in Quebec. So we see how extreme this turned out. Complete separation from Canada has been in the decline since 1995's referendum. The term sovereignty association is more common. Currently, the clear majority in Quebec desire more autonomy, but they do not want to be separate from Canada. So they are kind of arguing for something that's more similar to what's happening in China right now with the China-Hong Kong relationship. Hong Kong was given to the Chinese by the British in the 90s after they finally ended their imperial rule over that colony. But Hong Kong is very distinct from the rest of China, so it has this sort of semi-autonomous existence where they are part of China, but they have their own flag, they have their own government, but they are still a part of China. So they're trying to shuffle that sort of thing with Quebec, and it all relates to this idea of sovereignty movement and their perspective on national identity. They don't align themselves with this idea of this Anglo-Canadian national identity, more of a French-Canadian identity. So that brings into question, because Quebec is still a part of Canada, it's a province of Canada, so it does bring up the idea of the federal, provincial, territorial relation. So Canada, as a large country geographically, has two levels of government: a federal system, which we obviously know the federal government, based in Ottawa, our capital, is run by the House of Commons, the Senate, the Prime Minister, the Governor General. They are making decisions on a federal level. So the relationship between the two levels of government, the federal government and provincial/territorial government, can lead to conflict. Because in some cases, in some areas, the federal government has the final say. So for example, things like defense, the federal government has taken it upon themselves to say, we are going to control the Army of Canada, which kind of makes sense. But when it comes to other things, like, say, education and healthcare, the provinces have a lot more say, especially with education. Education in each province is different because the province is making its own decisions. Now, when it comes to, say, the education of the Indigenous and Aboriginal people of Canada, the First Nations people, that is a federal area of control. So there, you can see the sort of mishmash relationships they have. So Quebec's place in Canada is one example, but all the provinces and territories have conflicts with the federal government at some point. Right now, for us living in Alberta, we are seeing things with the federal carbon tax, and our province's government's opposing of this tax is an example of Alberta's sort of feud with the federal government. So most notably is regarding the environment, so that's what we're talking about in Alberta. The federal, provincial, territorial working group links the environment Canada is attempting to address specifically issues of common interest among the levels of government. So there are things that are distinct, but then there are a lot of gray areas where both sides kind of claim sort of control and sometimes even push the issue towards the other and saying, this is not our responsibility, this is a you responsibility. So these sort of things arise. So all provinces and territories are distinct in terms of population, area, and resources. As such, more matters which are national interest do not overlap with provincial or territorial concerns. For example, fisheries. And in Alberta, we don't really concern ourselves with like the coastline because we're landlocked. So that's why there's some things that we really have no distinct interest in being a part of, whereas other provinces do. So that sort of relationship is pretty shaky. And when we talked about non-nationalist loyalties a few units ago, and we talked about regionalism, this is a problem when we talk about federal and provincial relationships. Because for some people, they do not care what the federal government say because they're saying, I'm over here in Alberta or I'm over here in Manitoba. The federal government is all the way in Ottawa. How can they understand what we need? And then sometimes provincial governments will sort of play that sort of card. And you see it now in our province with things like the oil sands, the carbon tax, and Premier Kenny's position in terms of that sort of relationship with Prime Minister Trudeau. So that is one of the examples. On slide 55, this is a good segue into Aboriginal self-determination and land claims. This happened in 1990, the Oka crisis. Some of you may be aware of it. For those of you that are not, I would watch this. It is a very historic moment, and that photo is actually quite historic in terms of it speaks volumes about the relationship between the Canadian government and Aboriginal First Nations groups when it comes to the question of land claims. So I'd give that a watch. So Aboriginal self-determination and land claims. Originally, it was taught that the French and the British were the founders of Canada, but then it was said that the Canadians had three founders, including the Aboriginal peoples that shaped the land far before the English and the French. We talked about this a unit or two ago. When the British and the French arrived, they met the First Nations people. Now, if the First Nations people had not helped the British and the French, there was no way they would have been able to, survive as long as they did and thrive afterwards. So it is important to note that there is a huge part in the foundation of Canada, and it's due to the Aboriginal people. Some still disagree with this model, as there are many cultures that help shape Canada today. So then that gets into the question of, okay, when immigration started to be more of a thing, we have to say, okay, the Europeans that came, the Asians that came and helped build things in British Columbia, like, for example, the Pacific Railroad, they also have to have their moment in the sun. The numbered treaties which were used by the Canadian government to open settlement on the West have been criticized. So if you look at the territorial map of Canada, you can see everywhere moving west minus British Columbia is treated land. So we are on Treaty 7 land, or Treaty 6. I think it's Treaty 7. I don't know. When I lived in Edmonton, it was Treaty 7 or Treaty 6. Now I come back here. I get confused sometimes. It's okay. So each land has been, a treaty has been signed so that we live on it. The Aboriginal people saw it as essentially like we are leasing the land from them, whereas the Canadian government basically said, no, we're actually taking this land, and nothing you really do about it. If Canada was founded by 3, not 2 nations, should the original land claims be considered again? Land claims in British Columbia are a source of tension, as most of BC does not have a numbered treaty. So like I said, BC has none if you look at it. So then this question of land claim is really an issue there, especially recently when we looked at the pipeline that they're proposing to build from Alberta to Burnaby, British Columbia. It's going to go through a lot of territory that the Indigenous and First Nations people of BC are claiming their own, and they feel that this is a threat on their way of life. So like I said, when we look at this picture of the Oka crisis, it is very much, that speaks volumes to the relationship that the the First Nations and the government of Canada have when it comes to land claims. Neither wants to back down, and both want what they feel is rightfully theirs. So slide 57, I would watch this 7-minute video resolving land claims, because that is a very, very crucial point in the relationship between the federal government and the First Nations people. Because when we talk about land claims, it's not just where you live. Of course, it's really important to have that, your traditional homeland where you've lived. But it's also a lot more than that. When we talk about Aboriginal education, their classroom is the land. Their resource, their way of life comes from the land. One thing that Aboriginal people are guaranteed in by the Canadian government is the access to hunting, fishing, and trapping on land, because the land is so crucial to their idea of self-determination and their own identity. They pull directly from the land in this sense. So that is why this idea of land claim, it's not just a matter of, I want to build my house here. It's, this land is sacred, and land, it provides them with their way of life. So that's why it's such a contentious subject. So moving on now, the idea of bilingualism and multiculturalism, because Canada is a bilingual country. We speak English and we speak French. So if you have a dream of becoming a prime minister, you're going to have to learn both English and both French, because federally that has been established in the act by Pierre Trudeau. And Canada is also seen as a multicultural country. Case in point, when we were in class, look around, we're all different. A lot of us we're from different countries, or our parents came from different countries. So it does show you the multicultural face of Canada. Though many Canadians take pride in their diverse and multicultural society, a study shows that recent immigrants who belonged to a visible minority integrate more slowly than their white counterparts, as they feel less Canadian. So then this also brings up the question of non-nationalist loyalties. So these sort of things can also play a part in the slow integration of people into this greater Canadian society. Studies show and have sparked debate over the success of Canada's multicultural policy and the wisdom of promoting diversity. Pierre Trudeau is officially credited with Canada's modern understanding of nationalism. He passed the Multiculturalism Act while he was Prime Minister. Trudeau implemented officially bilingualism, partitions of Canada's current constitution, and established the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. As circumstances in Canada have changed, and so has the vision of Canada in the past half of the 20th century, French and English have been named the official languages, but Canada became officially a multicultural country. Now, when they're talking about this change, what they're meaning is, yes, French and English are our official languages, but I would guarantee you that in certain areas of this country, more people are speaking things like Tagalog, or they are speaking Hindi, or they're speaking Cantonese or Mandarin a lot more than they're speaking French. Case in point, if you look at our school, there are a lot of people who speak a second language. And if you multiply that by the immigration across Canada, English and French may not be the most widely spoken in Canada. Yes, they are officially recognized, but then that throws into question this idea of multiculturalism and bilingualism. And then when we question those sort of things, then we have to address the idea of national identity. What is Canada's national identity? If on one hand they're saying we're bilingual and we're multicultural, but then on the other hand, language-wise, we are a lot more than bilingual. Like I said, those languages are represented. Plus, we also have our own indigenous languages here too, that are slowly dying because, there's a lot of things to why they are dying. Primarily, the cultural genocide that was put on the indigenous people of Canada by the Canadian government through things like residential schools. But we're going off on a segue. So this sort of bilingual multiculturalism in relation to things like the First Nations and the French Canadians, it really throws into question this idea of Canadians' perspective on national identity. Along the same lines of the Indigenous or peoples, because when we say First Nations people, we are not talking about a specific, we can't blanket over all peoples. Because when we say First Nations, we can be talking about Cree, Blackfoot, Ojibwe, Inuit, any people from all over Canada, and they're all different. If you're a First Nation and you live in the Northwest Territories, your life is very different than someone who lives in the interior of BC or Alberta, and it's very different from if you are in the Maritimes, say in Newfoundland or in New Brunswick. It is completely different. It would be like saying, addressing everybody from Africa as saying African. Well, people who live in North Africa are supremely different and from those who live in Central Africa, who are different from people who live in West Africa, who are different from people who live in South Africa. So you can't just say African. You have to be specific. The same way you can't say First Nations and expect it just to blanket over all of them because they're all different. So then we have this idea of the Assembly of First Nations, the AFN. It's modeled after the UN General Assembly. The AFN represents the First Nations as represented by their chiefs. So it replaced the National Indian Brotherhood in the early 1980s. The principal aim of the AFN is to protect and advance Aboriginal and treaty rights and interests of the First Nations in Canada, including healthcare, education, culture, and language. So remember when we talked about responsibilities based on the federal and provincial levels? Some of those things that we just talked about in the AFN are federal and some of them are provincial. So the AFN is actually it's a really important body in Canada because it focuses its attention on advocating for the rights of all First Nations people, regardless of whatever band they are from, whatever sort of region they are from. Really, like when they label it like the like the United Nations, it is such, and it's a really important aspect of this idea of the relationship with the federal government and First Nations people. Now we talk about still in the idea of First Nations self-determination and national identity, Métis Inuit self-government. I talked about this in Monday's video, so I'll just readdress it here. In 1993, Nunavut Land Claim Agreement was signed by the Nunavut Tungavik Incorporated, the Government of Canada, and the Government of the Northwest Territories. This led to the creation of the separate territory of Nunavut in 1999. This agreement is the largest Aboriginal land claim settlement in Canadian history. Substantial control over the land area and resources of Nunavut were agreed to. Over 83% of the population of Nunavut identify themselves as Inuit. So when we talked about this on Monday, I was just addressing that Nunavut is an excellent example of a settling of this land claim debate, and now Nunavut is, like we said, 82% inhabited by the Inuit people, and its government as such is kind of is run on that style as well, which is it's a good example of self-governance. So to summarize, what are Canada's perspectives on national identity? Well, it all depends on really who you are or who your people are, because Canada has labeled itself as multicultural, and it has gone down that way thanks to the work of Pierre Trudeau. We have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms protecting the rights of people regardless of who they are, where they're from. We have the Bilingual Act, which makes us a bilingual country, and it recognizes the other languages as well, but not officially. So we have that avenue as well. So it's really difficult to try to come up with this idea of perspective of national identity. I guess you could really just say it's a multicultural perspective, but then at the same time, when you're going that way, you have to also think of things like those own people's rights to self-determination, like the French Canadian, and this idea of separation from Canada, or even liberation in some cases for some people. And then at the same time, I have to look at the perspective of First Nations people and this idea of land claims. Okay, we are going to, if we're a part of Canada and we're all represented equally, we need to talk about land claims and this idea of equal, coming to the table as equals as well. So that's it for this unit. Like I said, look out for a link in our announcement section to a document that will basically sum up this unit. Instead of doing a test, we're just going to do a project, and then when you're finished with that, send it to me. If you have any questions or concerns, if you would like to set up a Zoom chat to help you go through things that you're not quite understanding, let me know. And if not, I will see you later. Have a good day.